Welcome to the class video for Module 5, the second of two modules devoted to Jean-Jacques Rousseau's On Social Contract. In Module 4, we looked at books 1 and 2 of the text, and here in Module 5, we'll finish up Rousseau by looking at his theories of government and revolution in Book 3. Your assignments for Module 5 are to finish the Rousseau reading, finish Book 3, take the Rousseau 3 reading quiz, and to, as always, identify passages for your concept essay. I want to emphasize here in Module 5, your next assignment after you complete Module 5 is to write and submit your concept essay. That assignment will be much easier if you start at having an idea of the passages you want to write on and the constitutional clause that you're going to focus on. So this is a good opportunity for you to sort of lock in the passages that you think you're going to want to write on. In Book 3, Rousseau really has two goals. One of them kind of explicit and obvious and already stated in books 1 and 2. And the other one implied. Rousseau sort of assumes you will understand the significance of his second goal. The first goal is, of course, to complete his model of the social contract and show its contrast to Locke. From the very beginning, or at least from chapter 5 of book 1, Rousseau has been emphatic with us that there's a two-step process, that the original social compact creates this thing called the general will or the sovereign, and then only after that can the sovereign create government, and government is a distinct thing from the sovereign. Don't confuse the two. So now that we come to Book 3, of course, Rousseau wants to describe government, and implicit in that is, of course, how do governments change, or what is the theory of revolution in Rousseau's model. But because Rousseau himself assumes, and also assumes that his readers will assume, that everybody already knows what the three types of government are, that is to say, the government of the one, the government of the few, or the government of the many. That is Aristotle's constitutional theory, or what we've referred to as classical constitutional science. Rousseau assumes that these are all the governments that can exist in the world. We all know that because we've all read Aristotle. The second implied goal that Rousseau is trying to achieve here is to reconcile or show the relationship between social contract theory and classical constitutional science, or social contract theory and Aristotle. This was a problem that John Locke almost completely ignored, right? In Locke's mind, Parliament was, or should be, the dominant institution and essentially the voice of the people. Locke did not engage in the problem of, well, here I'm giving you this new theory, let me tell you what you used to believe was true, now here's how you can believe my new model. There are a group of social contract writers. Rousseau likes to mention Grotius, and if you took Foundations and read Hobbes, Hobbes would be another, who think that the logic of consent to the social contract makes inevitable the absolute rule of the most powerful man, right? That is the logic of the bargain. If what you want is protection, the only way to get maximal protection is to give up all of your rights, because there is an inverse relationship between those two things. So there is an implication for at least some social contract writers that, sure, it's consistent with Aristotle, it supports the idea of the rule of the one. But that is not at all, of course, what Rousseau wants to conclude, right? He has exactly the opposite idea, that we can have both freedom, maximal freedom, and maximal protection at the same time, that we don't have to give up the egalitarianism of the social contract model simply in exchange for protection. So implied for Rousseau here in Book 3 is the notion we can believe in and adopt the principles of popular consent, and yet all the forms of Aristotle's constitutional model are still available to us. The social contract model does not preclude any of these particular forms. And implicit in that, then, is a more Aristotelian idea about the nature of revolution, as we shall see. The reason this is important for the terms of this course and understanding the texts on the syllabus for this semester is that this is precisely the problem that James Madison and the framers of the Constitution are going to become aware of and try to resolve in the summer of 1787 as they frame the U.S. federal Constitution. A kind of caricature general view that they held was that the problems that the new American Republic was facing in the 1780s, in the decade after the Revolution, was that the revolutionary constitutions had gone so extreme to the forms of the social contract model. They were so radical in their egalitarianism that the American thinkers had forgotten the principles of Aristotle. And so the federal Constitution represents an attempt by Madison and the framers to bring back Aristotelian principles and reinstill them in the social contract form. So the Americans are going to come up with their own solution to this same problem that Rousseau is wrestling with here in Book 3 of Social Contract. As we turn to the text now, then we want to separate the text really into three segments. In the first two chapters, in essentially the introduction to Book 3, Rousseau is going to give us a bunch of really bad math problems. He's going to describe to us a series of kind of mathematical ratios that really don't make a lot of sense when you dissect the language of the text. The big picture here to start with, and then we'll try to piece apart his descriptions, is that again and again and again we'll see that he's trying to create these triads, these threesomes. So he's going to describe government as an intermediary between the sovereign and the subject, so a third thing. So now we have a relationships between three things. He's going to describe to us the magistrate's three wills and how they're in competition with us. And he's also going to describe to us this rule about how big an area or population that a country you want to try to create, that is with a lot of area or a lot of people in it, and how relatively small the government should then be, and vice versa. If you have a small area or population that you're trying to govern, that then you can have a large government. And so again, if you imagine a maximal of that spectrum, and then a spot happily in the middle, a kind of moderate area with a moderate sized government, you see that there's then this tension between these three poles. What Rousseau's trying to do is, if you will, bend the binary of the social contract model, you versus the collective, right? And that's very much the way Locke thinks about it as well, right? It is this oppositional force that we have to overcome, your submission and surrender and give over your rights, but then can you command obedience and adherence to the terms of the social contract from the government? This oppositional, which seems so potent and sort of the basic architecture of the social contract model. Rousseau here in Book 3 is trying to bend that into a triad, right? Again and again. And of course what he's trying to do is set up the basic psychology of the social contract model as the foundation of, as the kind of psychological energy that drives the tension between Aristotle's three constitutional forms, if you will. We great thinkers here in the 17th and 18th century, what we have discovered is the essential human nature, the competition among different elements of our human nature that is in fact the secret sauce that's driving the theory we've known for 2,000 years about these constitutional types. So let's turn now to the text and see some of these bad math story problems that Rousseau gives us in the first two chapters of Book 3. All right, now we cannot begin Book 3 and skip over this wonderful opening line of Chapter 1 of Book 3. Rousseau writes, I warn the reader that this chapter requires careful reading, and that I am unable to make myself clear to those who refuse to be attentive. This is a wonderful admonition to undergraduate writers, but if after concluding the previous reading assignment on the left-hand column of page 14 you recall his declamation, all my ideas are consistent but I cannot expound them all at once, if you have the suspicion that maybe Rousseau is not completely confident that all of his ideas do indeed make sense, you may be on to something there. So it's a wonderful opening line to a chapter, and it's a wonderful admonition for undergraduate first-time readers of the text. Nevertheless, in this beginning of chapter 1, Rousseau wants to discover the fundamental powers of government, executive and legislative powers, in the psychology of the human will. He says, following this first line, every action is produced by the concurrence of two causes, one moral, i.e. the will, which determines the act, the other physical, i.e. the power, which executes it. When I walk towards an object, it is necessary first that I should will to go there, and in the second place, that my feet should carry me. If a paralytic wills to run, and an active man wills not to, they will both stay where they are. The body politic has the same motive powers. Here too, force and will are distinguished, will under the name of legislative power, and force under that of executive power. So notice the contrast here with Locke's explanation of these same foundational powers. For Locke, every individual has two rights, two foundational rights in the state of nature. We each get to determine what the law of nature is, and we each have the right to enforce it or execute punishments on people who violate it. When we surrender our rights at the moment of the social contract, those are the two fundamental things that we are signing over and allowing the umpire to determine for us. So it is internal for Locke, but notice the difference here for Rousseau. It's about the logic or the tension in our psychological desires, right? Do I want to go there? Are my feet able to carry me? It is not so much that those are sort of rights like little badges that I carry that I can take off my shirt and throw into the center circle to allow the collective to have. Those are the intrinsic kind of physics, if you will, psychological physics of making decisions, of every free action. They are inherent in every being that would want to engage in the activity of free action. They're necessary components. So of course they're necessary components of government. But the implications, of course, of that, which were, again, inferred, not stated explicitly in Locke then, is why isn't government fundamentally structured as a binary between the legislative power and the executive power? Why wouldn't our constitutional model be fundamentally about this two-part thing rather than the three-part thing, both that we're accustomed to in our federal constitutional tradition, right? Executive, legislative, and judicial, which is a new invention and not something that would be available to either Locke or Rousseau in the time that they were writing. But the three-part model that is available to Locke and Rousseau is Aristotle's model of the one, the few, and the many. So there's a tension between the way social contract theory thinks about the development of fundamental governmental powers, that it results in this binary, this tension between executive and legislative, and Aristotelian or classical constitutional science, which thinks about it as a balance among three powers. So Rousseau is going to perform a little trick then, and he's going to imagine that government however it's structured, whether it's 2 branches, 3 branches, 4 branches, 100 branches, however you want to do it, is in fact one entity that exists in between 2 other entities. Look at the highlighted passage on the top of the left-hand column of 15. What then is government? An intermediary body set up between the subjects and the sovereign to secure their mutual correspondence, charged with the execution of the laws and the maintenance of liberty, both political and civil. And it doesn't matter how many there are, right? In the next paragraph, the members of this body are called magistrates or kings, that is to say governors, and the whole body bears the name prince. So this is a confusing usage of that word prince. And if you took foundations and read both Machiavelli's Prince and his discourses on Livy, you may have engaged this before. The prince here is a plural. It's like band or team, right? It's a singular that implies a group. The prince is the entire body, the government. If that was a monarchy, it would be the king and all of his appointees and officers. If it was an aristocracy, it would be the few who get to rule, the council and all their appointees and dependents. And if it was a democracy, it would be all the people who get to vote and all the officers of government. Whether it's a handful of people, a moderate number of people, or a large number of people, they all bear the name prince, which is a euphemism or synonym for government. So government is one thing that exists in a relationship between these 2 other things, the sovereign and the subjects. And they have a interdependence, as we see at the top of the right-hand column of 15 in the highlighted passage. Furthermore, none of these 3 terms can be altered without the equality being instantly destroyed. If the sovereign desires to govern, or the magistrate to give laws, or if the subject refuses to obey, disorder takes the place of regularity, force and will no longer act together, and the state is dissolved and falls into despotism or anarchy. So there's a dynamic relationship, a dynamic dialectical interdependence among these 3 elements: the sovereign, the government, and the subjects. They're yearning for equilibrium and balance, but as he says in the final line of that paragraph, but as countless events may change the relations of a people, not only may different governments be good for different peoples, but also for the same people at different times. This is radically different than Locke's approach. The inference in Locke is that there's only one institution that can adequately or legitimately represent the people's voice. That's the legislature or parliament. And there's a strong implicit logic in that, as we'll see when we get to the American writers. They very much follow the Lockean vein here. But in Rousseau's approach, because he's trying to reconcile social contract theory with Aristotelian theory, he's led to the conclusion that any number of constitutions could be, i.e., democratic, that is to say, represent the will of the people, even if the people don't actually get to participate in that government, right? A monarchy could be a valid and legitimate expression of the sovereign will. And it's that dynamic relationship among these 3 parts, trying to sort of illustrate the ratios and how as one gets stronger, others get weaker necessarily, that constitutes these couple of word story problems or math story problems in chapter 2. If we start at the last paragraph at the bottom of the right-hand column of 15, he said, Rousseau writes, "The body of the magistrates may be composed of a greater or lesser number of members. We said that the relation of the sovereign to the subjects was greater in proportion as the people was more numerous, and by a clear analogy, we may say the same of the relation of the government to the magistrates. But the total force of government," continuing at the top of the left-hand column of 16, "but the total force of government, being always that of the state, is invariable, so that the more of this force it expends on its own members, the less it has left to employ on the whole people. The more numerous the magistrates, therefore, the weaker the government." Now, this is one of those classic kind of Rousseauian paradoxes. This seems to be nonsensical on the surface. How could it be true that the more numerous the magistrates in government, that is to say, the more officers of government there are, that would make the government weaker, right? That is counterintuitive, should seem on the face of it absurd. But Rousseau's notion is that when you have a government and you have members of the government, you have to expend a certain amount, a certain kind of quota of governmental power corralling and organizing the members of the government, if you will. Keep them from becoming corrupt and just following your orders and carrying out your will. So the government of one man, a monarchy or an absolute ruler, is the most powerful government because it has the least opposition to overcome. It has to spend the least government resources or energy corralling the officers of government to implement its will. At the other end of the spectrum, something like a democracy where everybody gets a say on what the rules are, the government is going to expend so much energy organizing all those magistrates, because everybody gets a say, and organizing them, that by the time it's done and makes a decision, it has very little energy left over, or power left over, to then actually implement its policy. And that's because there is this intrinsic competition of psychological wills among members of the government. And that's the focus of the next highlighted passage on the left-hand column of 16. In the person of the magistrate, we can distinguish three essentially different wills. First, the private will of the individual, tending only to his personal advantage. Second, the common will of the magistrates, which is relative solely to the advantage of the prince, and may be called corporate will, being general in relation to the government and particular in relation to the state of which the government forms part. And in the third place, the will of the people, or the sovereign will, which is general both in relation to the state regarded as the whole, and to the government regarded as part of the whole. This again is opaque and ephemeral and hard to grasp your mind around. We have already talked about in books 1 and 2 this tension between the individual psychology and the collective will. Right? The collective will requires your absolute obedience. It's intrinsic in you as a human being to desire to have your own identity, your own will, and so there's a tension there. Rousseau is here introducing a third will, this corporate will, or the will of the magistrates or the members of government. So if I am a member of a government, imagine I'm a senator, right? I have an interest in being a senator. It's good to be senator. There are a lot of privileges of being senator. I might be a Republican senator and have many interests different than my Democratic senator, right? A Democratic senator in the Senate. But we have a common interest in the privileges of being a senator, and that's our corporate will, right? Our desire for the government to do well simply because we're members of the government, not necessarily for the common good of the citizens, and even maybe sometimes contrary to our own private interests. So the corporate will is the interest of members of government in being members of government, all the privileges and the power that come along with that. So there are three competing wills within the person of the magistrate. Now, Rousseau claims on the right-hand column of 16, in the paragraph that starts in the middle, that these relations are incontestable, right? And we don't necessarily have to follow Rousseau that far. We don't necessarily have to agree with him that these are incontestable assertions. But the conclusion that he wants to reach then is foundational at the bottom of the right-hand column in the highlighted passage at the bottom of the right-hand column of 16, leading to the top of 17. From this it follows that the relation of the magistrates to the government should vary inversely to the relation of the subjects to the sovereign. That is to say, the larger the state, the more should the government be tightened, so that the number of rulers diminish in proportion to the increase of the people. Now, this again is one of those Rousseauian paradoxes or counterintuitive statements. The more people in the country, the fewer people who should be allowed to rule. If you have fewer people in the country, then it's okay to let a lot of those people be part of the government, which seems entirely anti-democratic. So let's take a moment then and return then to summarize these three kind of mathematical principles and what Rousseau's. Okay, so again we see these three different ways of trying to show these proportional dynamic relationships among three things. First, we see the description of government. Even though government is appropriately divided between legislative and executive, it is a two-part thing, the will and the force. It exists as a thing between these two other entities, the sovereign and the subjects, and they are in a dynamic relation. If any one of these falter, then the whole system goes kaplooey. We also see this description of the magistrate's three wills, the general will, a particular will, and this third thing, the corporate will. And as we turn now to see the rule of one, the rule of all, and the rule of the few, what we'll see is that they're different combinations of these three wills. The rule of the one unites the particular and the corporate will into a single individual, but it's the most alienated from the general will. In the rule of all, or democracy, the general will and the corporate will are one thing, right? The people as a sovereign body and the government are identical, but it's most alienated from the particular wills of individuals. And of course, then the rule of the few is the moderate between those two. And then finally, this idea about the size of government, or the size of the country or the population that you're trying to rule, and therefore the size of the government you should attempt to rule it with. What Rousseau is doing here is describing what is a foundational axiom of Aristotelian politics, or sort of the received wisdom of classical constitutional science for 2,000 years preceding the 18th century. And that's the following notion. If you want to have a rich, powerful country, a big country that's growing and expanding and taking over other countries, and other countries have to respect in the world, the only rational government for you to adopt is a monarchy, a rule of the one. Because only a monarch is powerful enough, right, to organize his own subjects and to create large armies that can go out and conquer other peoples. If you want to have a democracy, if you want to let the people rule, the only place where you should try to do that is a very small country, ideally something about the size of a city-state, because of course the great republics of the ancient world, particularly of ancient Greece, but also of Renaissance Italy, and the few examples in the Middle Ages, are virtually all examples of city-states. So classical Athens and classical Sparta are the two great examples. The reason they were able to have popular rule is because there were so few people subject to the government, and they were all able to come to an agreement because they were a small group and they were from the same town, and so they had the same common interests. As soon as you try to rule a large nation and you have different ethnic groups and different religious groups and different economic interests and all manner of differences, those populations are going to be naturally driven to conflict. They're not going to agree with each other. And if you try to rule them with a democracy, you're merely formalizing their conflict, right? You're embedding that conflict in the governing system, which is just an invitation to anarchy and defeat. If you want to have a big country with lots of different people in it, then you have to have a strong ruler who can force them to obey. This is classical received wisdom, common sense in the politics of the ancient world. Of course, social contract theory undermines or challenges exactly that premise. And so here's an example of a dilemma in the relationship between social contract theory and Aristotelianism, and indeed it's one of the strongest arguments of those Americans who did not want to adopt a federal constitution, those who wanted to remain with their state constitutions, is exactly this idea. It's insane to imagine you can rule an entire continent with a republic. Our best and safest governments are those governments who are most local to us. And we'll see that in the text when we get to the American text. So you can see how Rousseau is trying to kind of massage the difference between this binary conflict between you and the collective and transform it into a trilogy, a triumvirate, a balance between these three elements that can account for then the generation of Aristotle's three constitutional forms. And that's where we'll turn to in the next segment of the class.